Welcome to the Victoria Rumble Room, the little show that could, the little show with a big heart and, well, small budget. I'm Robin Adair, and speaking about a worldwide reach that we have with this program on the World Wide Web, in a galaxy far, far away, known as Saanich, is my compatriot, my partner in crime, Jolton John Jurisic, the Croatian sensation. Good morning, John.
I will. Good morning, Robin. I'll never, ever be able to match that intro. However, I'll try to match the sentiment. Saanich, gorgeous out here, gorgeous out here. Seems very, genteel, everything's going nice, but it's not. The world, as we know it, is got issues upon issues upon issues, of which we'll talk about several today. As it happens, CamWest Global referenced our show, the Andrew Weaver interview. So not only were we universal, we were also provincial last week.
I think we actually appeared for about 3 seconds on Global, didn't we?
Yeah, two seconds longer than I thought we would be. So what's going on? What's on your mind today, Robin?
Well, there's so much on my mind. There's so many things that are troubling me, John. We got 1,000 people now arrested at Fairy Creek, and that's back in the court. And I don't know how that old growth logging dispute's ever going to get resolved, because both sides they're stuck. And the First Nations, I believe, are not being listened to. I don't see a way out on this one unless the courts get tougher and people don't just get a slap on the wrist after they get arrested.
Doesn't this reflect sort of a community-wide sort of consistency? Let's just be mad. Let's just protest. Let's just piss everyone off. No solution, Robin. What are we going to do? Can the Victoria Rumble Room make a difference?
Well, we're going to certainly try. And that one is troubling. And of course, none of us want to see them cut down all the old growth trees. We want to see the Pashadat people, the First Nations people there respected. We want to see a fair resolution. It can't be black and white. It certainly can't be all what the lumber companies want or all what the protesters want. And it's frustrating. And we're also stuck in this terrible, terrible battle between the vast majority of us who've got our double vaccinations and got our vaccination passports. I got mine.
Yeah.
And these anti-vaxxers who are just as loud as ever. They were marching on hospitals in Vancouver Island, in British Columbia. They're back doing it again across Canada. Now, I admit in Vancouver and Victoria, they didn't go to the hospital, so maybe they've learned a lesson, but they're still marching on hospitals across the country and other parts of Canada. And it's nuts, John. It's crazy. Why are they doing that?
It used to be that we would have at least some understanding of why somebody's doing something, even though we completely disagree with it. There'd be some part of it. Okay. I kind of get it. I don't get it on these last two issues we just talked about. And we could list another 10 of them. So in any other day, in any other generation, had there been some kind of medical effect that would be killing people and that could impact you and I and our millions of listeners and could kill them, people would be lined up trying to eliminate that issue. But
I think we're so influenced by what goes on in the States. People see the Donald Trump phenomena and all this heavy right-wing movement down there. I think there's still 90 million Americans who've refused to get vaccinated. They're way behind us percentage-wise. And people here on our right wing are influenced. Look at even Howard Galganoff, our guest last week, who says we are far left communicators. That somehow you and I, John, are suddenly on the far left. We're far left liberals. That's how he's described us.
A lot of my friends would be surprised to hear that.
I think people that we know on the far left would be very surprised. But I mean, Howard and his wife have been double vaccinated. What they don't like is that the government is telling them that they must get vaccinated, that they are going to have a passport. But it's the only way to nudge these people forward so we can all have security. It's crazy. And, these people that are marching on hospitals, it's insanity. And when you think about insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, never getting a good result and wondering why. Well, that's crazy. And This action of the protesters against hospitals, it's working against themselves because, let's face it, the hospitals are jammed with people suffering from COVID, and the vast majority of them on ICUs are people who've refused to get vaccinated. They're protesting, they're harassing medical people who are actually there to help them. If they fall through the cracks, and many of them will, they should get vaccinated. So yes, you have the right to get out there and be heard. You have the right to protest. You don't have the right to harass. Get over it.
Perfect. It makes so much sense. Common sense has disappeared from parts of our dialogue and our community. Talking about common sense, Robin. Here now, the poor City of Victoria taxpayers are unloading hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to fix policies from this council around cleaning up the parks. Maybe you shouldn't have let them in the first place.
Well, the bill that I saw on the weekend in the Times Colonist was, what, $525,000 to clean up the parks damaged because of this camping that went on during the heat of the pandemic. And it's going to be a lot more than that. If they're saying it's 525, they've spent money on it already. This is 525 additional $1,000.
Additional, exactly.
Loaded on top.
Yeah.
It's going to be $1 million to clean that up.
Oh, man. I've talked to some folks, friends of mine live in Victoria. You're a Esquimalt, I'm Saanich. And they're really pissed. I don't know where that's going to go. Is that going to turn into activism, in the City of Victoria? Well, it should.
Well, so-called activists have caused this thing. And, I'm so put out with civic politicians who think a place like Victoria is a city-state. And yet the difference is, if it was a city-state, if it was a real state, they could run deficits. Well, municipalities can't run deficits. So they run these massive tax bills. And who's going to get stuck paying that on their homeowner payments? It's going to be the taxpayers at a very local level. And it's ridiculous. The province, federal government have stepped up. They've paid for some housing. They've paid to move the people out of the parks now. They still have a lot more to do. There have to be a lot more programs, but the municipalities are left to clean up these parks that should never have been occupied the way they were. Certainly not Beacon Hill Park. That was a travesty. And, in a business, if this was a business, John, and both you and I come from the business world, heads would roll. And it's not going to happen here. So people need to remember this when the next civic election comes.
Right on, Robin. Great editorial. But, the way people can make an impact on these issues is make sure you vote. And we now have an election that's just a week away. So people get out and vote.
I voted.
Yeah, you voted.
I've already voted.
Well, I'm going to hope to try to vote before next Monday, but we'll see. But in the middle of this, a bombshell. There's been a lot of scandals that have surrounded Justin Trudeau. One of them is with his cabinet minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, former cabinet minister. She's published a book in which she accuses him of lying. And so wonder if this is going to make any difference to the voters. What do you think?
Well, I really wonder at this stage whether Judy Wilson-Raybould is going to be able to draw much more ire on that issue than was already there in the first place. Of course, she was famously brought into the cabinet as an Indigenous leader, somebody who could be the Attorney General with the national government, and it got into a mess. And there's a lot of innuendo from both sides about why that happened. But Jody Wilson-Raybould left under a cloud, and she sat as an independent. She's now written a book about that experience. It's just come out with about a week to go before the election. And I think that Mr. Trudeau is probably just brushing that aside and hoping that that doesn't land too much. And I guess we'll see. But, the interesting tie-in there is Judy Wilson-Raybould's chief of staff was Jessica Prince. Jessica Prince, I met her years ago. She grew up in Victoria, and her father happens to be UVIC professor and political scientist, Dr. Michael Prince,
Come on.
who I've known him for over 30 years. And as it happens, he's now going to join us in the Rumble Room to talk about what's going to happen in this federal election. Let's zoom him in.
Right on. Dr. Michael Prince, so nice to have you in the Victoria Rumble Room.
Thanks, John.
You and I have rumbled on CFAX long time ago. Man, did that Sunday mornings, that ruined my Saturday night partying, I tell you. However, I think somehow I was able to manage some questions for you. But it's great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks, John. Real pleasure to be on with you and Robin.
Yeah, totally. Well, come on, let's get right into this, okay? Let's get right into this election. I mean, that's why we got you here today. So hard not to reflect on some of more recent events, that being Jody Wilson-Raybould, antagonist, let's say, for Justin Trudeau years past, has just published a book. That book is supposed to be a tell-all. And she suggests pretty much that Justin Trudeau told her to play by these rules. What do you think? Is this going to hurt the Liberals? What sort of impact on the election do you think this is going to have?
Well, I think, the first part of the campaign was fairly flat for Mr. Trudeau. And he's never still given a good answer as to why we are in the middle of a 44th general election here in Canada. And I think polls have shown that at least 3/4 of Canadians, when asked, they think this was an unnecessary and an unwanted and perhaps even risky election to be calling in the middle of COVID. And I think her book was planned, Jody Wilson-Raybould's book was planned to be released, I think, this fall in any case. So when there was there've been a lot of rumors around a federal election swirling back almost to, back in February and March even, people were talking about it. And then we saw MPs giving what they were calling farewell addresses in the House of Commons in June. You kind of know that, well, the secret's out, obviously, of people saying, well, I don't think I'll be back in the fall. And it's been great, and I'm retiring and all that. So I think her publishers, HarperCollins, they were sort of banking on the idea that there could be an election. But in any case, the book was, I think, slated to come out. There's a chapter on SNC, the Ladalon case, which was really what brought down Jody Wilson-Raybould's own career as a cabinet minister, and Jane Philpott, as well as the resignation of Jerry Butts, the Prime Minister's principal secretary, and the clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick. So, some very high profile people, both on the appointed side and on the elected side, brought down by this. Trudeau trying to get some momentum. I think after those disastrous leader debate formats we saw last week, which I think brought Canadians together in a unanimous view that we need a better format.
Right.
I did want to ask you, and Michael, great to have you on the show.
Yeah.
We first met back in the early 90s on my Czech TV show called Government Street.
That's right.
And then we also tangled a little bit when I had AM 900 in my radio talk show. So it's been a long time since you and I actually talked on any kind of a platform. So it's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks,
but I did want to dip back on the leaders debate.
Sure.
There's been actually almost as much said about Shachi Kurl and the way she handled things as a moderator as the way the candidates themselves actually conducted themselves. I didn't get the sense after watching that anybody really shone other than perhaps because there were such low expectations, perhaps the Green leader did better than people thought, but I didn't think the other leaders particularly came across in a roaring way. What was your estimation? What did you think was wrong with that format? And do you think it made any difference?
Well, I think, let's talk about Annamie Paul, who's the Green Party leader, who up until then, I think most Canadians still did not really have a good sense of who she was, what she stood for, or even heard her voice. Up until that time, she's stuck very close to her own riding in Toronto Centre. She's also, since the debates, Robin, made a stunning admission that a lot of her candidates really would not prefer her to come near their riding. Now, we know that's the case with other leaders and other campaigns over the years where, your leader might not be very popular. And so if you had your druthers, you'd rather have the leader stay away. It might hurt your campaign locally. But for her to actually say it out loud to press, I thought was quite a stunning revelation, and just shows the depth of the internal struggles and turmoil that still afflict the Green Party of Canada. She did well, but she doesn't have the resources or the unity around her party to enjoy any kind of bounce, as journalists would call it, right? To go out on the weekend and this week and sort of, talk about a key soundbite she made that really sort of impressed people. Yeah. I think the format, people were looking to see Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau, have at it on 2 or 3 key issues and really get to see what the two front runners had to say for themselves on some key issues. The format, was so scripted, so moderated. I don't fault the journalists doing it. I think they wanted to kind of get the leaders off talking points and to get them to actually answer questions rather than, quote, pivot and go off on something else, which, as you well know in your career, is a good that's what we call a good politician, someone who knows how to pivot, deflect, and wander off the topic. I think we got to have a rethink, though, as to how these debates are run. I like the idea that we have established a commission to try to run them more independently, but you still saw it as, I think, we need to have a rethink on how those debates are run. I like the idea when there's one-on-ones. Some of the media outlets have had one-on-ones that should actually get more airplay and more distribution in the country, where, a leader sits down with one journalist, maybe 2, and they have a half hour, and really get them. And if they're good political journalists, they'll ask the tough questions and they'll push and they'll get back to the questions. And so,
Michael, I'd like to get back to this sort of NDP Green.
Sure.
Thing, okay, which clearly is a big thing in BC.
Yeah. Huge on Vancouver Island.
Yeah. Signs are everywhere, and so your opinion. Of course, I'm always pissed off every election that the election's won. I haven't even voted yet. They've already won it. And, okay. and then you got this dynamic here that we seem to care about, but not much of the rest of Canada cares about nonetheless. Mm-hmm. Where will that disenchanted Green vote go? And I think it is disenchanted. Does it go to the NDP? Does it go to the Liberals? Like, who's going to benefit from this?
Well, I was talking to someone just earlier this morning who had attended an all-candidates meeting, and lo and behold, they heard the People's Party candidate in his closing remarks make a pitch to disgruntled Green voters. And I thought, okay, well, you look for your voters where you can, I guess. But that speaks, John, to your question, where if people who are, if you're a deep Green, committed person to the party, you're going to vote for your party. I mean, and that's same for NDP and Conservatives and Liberals. It's people who, over the last few elections, people like Elizabeth May were able to woo people to the Green cause and to the Green movement, whether it's because of the optimism, the idealism, and the dissatisfaction with the old parties. And that just hasn't worked this time. I mean, except for that very few moments where Annemie Paul had an opportunity in the English language debate, most Canadians really don't know what she stands for. The party released their platform pretty late into the campaign. They didn't even have a press conference around it. It sort of quietly got released like on a Friday afternoon. It was, if you wanted to guarantee zero interest or attention on your platform, they did it the way you should, I guess. But
well, they sort of grew out of a need to emphasize climate change policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would say, gentlemen, I don't want us to spend all this time on the Green Party, which I think is really not a player in this at all. We'll be very fortunate to win 2 or 3 seats in the whole country. Yeah. If that, they're big on Vancouver Island. I suspect Elizabeth May will be reelected. Maybe Mr. Manley, Nanaimo. But aside from that, I can't imagine we're going to see a lot of Green wins. The 3 big parties are the 3 parties that are important here. And the NDP, I'd suggest, is more important than they might be, because I'm sure you agree with me, Michael, a good chance of a minority government, whether it's going to be Tory or Liberal, which is an open door for the NDP, correct?
Yeah, that's their best case scenario. I mean, well, their best case technicolor dream, of course, is that they win the most seats, but I don't think any pollster is suggesting that's going to happen. So you're right. The best case for classic NDP position is do not give Mr. O'Toole or Mr. Trudeau a majority government. Let's go back. Unfortunately, he's kind of saying to Canadians, let's have what we just had for the last 2 years. Let's have a minority government, which from their point of view is working well. I think a lot of Canadians tend to agree with him on that proposition. Things were being accomplished. You can say that, well, maybe some of that was the COVID effect around some unanimity around that. But even still, there were a lot of other issues where there was some consensus and some support across 2 or 3 parties at a time. And so you're right, Jagmeet Singh's gotta hope that he bounces back from losing about 20 seats in 2019, bounce back up. That'll be a victory. Win back some seats and see a minority government where he's got a larger caucus, stronger voice, and he might be faced with an interesting problem election night, Robin, which is, let's say that Mr. O'Toole wins a handful more seats than Mr. Trudeau does. There's a good chance that Mr. O'Toole will win the popular vote again, although the polls are suggesting maybe not. But we got that wrong in the last election, where Andrew Scheer surprised people with a stronger popular vote overall. But let's say they're very close on popular vote, and O'Toole wins a bucket full of seats more than Mr. Trudeau. But Mr. Trudeau, as you know, constitutionally does not have to resign. The question is, could he enjoy the confidence of a majority of the members of parliament in the House? Well, then all eyes will turn on Mr. Singh. Say he has 35 MPs, maybe 40, he's up. And he'll probably get asked a lot this week about this if the polls don't shift a lot. Say, would you ever see yourself supporting Aaron O'Toole? Is there a scenario where you would do that?
And of course, we saw that in BC with the Green Party picking the NDP and putting them back in power, even though Christy Clark had actually taken more seats.
See, absolutely. And so he will get pressed, I would think, by your colleagues in the news world. And so he should be asked, because voters, a lot of people will decide in the last 48 hours, last 72 hours. And depending what those last few polls suggest, that's a fair question to ask all the leaders, but certainly Mr. Singh is let's call him the kingmaker or whatever you want to call him, as he'll have a voice there. If he goes into a scenario like that, would he insist on a more formal agreement that we saw here in BC between the NDP and the Greens, a kind of a 2-year agreement, support you on supply and confidence votes, budget. But I would think Mr. Singh would want to have a list of 4 or 5 demands that would be required, whether that's on taxing the wealthy, the ultra rich, pharmacare or dental care, certainly 2 or 3 other pet projects, and agree with Mr. Trudeau perhaps on the childcare package, which is different from Mr. O'Toole's approach, and kind of sign a 1-year, 2-year deal. And anyways, that's an interesting scenario to think about. But I think you're right. I don't see a majority government happening. So we then get into these possibilities of what role the NDP get to play in that.
So, Mike, as millions of people watch this show, I'm always asked questions about issues as I'm walking down the street. You know how it is.
Yep.
And the question: who's going to win? Who's going to win? And my universal answer is, I don't know what's going to happen in Quebec. I don't know this. I don't know the battleground there. Could you please give us a sense of what you think is going to happen? Because that might be where it's won or lost.
Yes, it could be. And I always remember a lovely metaphor or imagery that Chantal Hébert, the Toronto Star journalist, and who's on the At Issue panel on CBC.
The great hair. She has the great hair.
You're right. She was actually here in Victoria after, I forget whether it was the 2011, I think it was after the 2011 election, and the Great Orange Wave that occurred in Quebec when the NDP suddenly won, 50 seats in Quebec, John, and just blew us all away. It was right out of the textbooks. None of us saw it coming. And she was asked and said, she didn't see it coming either. She said, Quebec voters are sort of like the Canada geese. You just don't understand it, but they know how to form the V formation. And they know that after a while, the bird at front changes position. And as human beings, we watch this marvelous formation take shape, but we don't really understand it. We can understand it after the fact, or we can point to it, but while it's happening. And I just find that as an interesting story. But I think, seriously, a couple of points. One, I don't think Aaron O'Toole has really connected well with Quebec. I think he's offside on gun control. He's offside on the arts and culture. He's offside on childcare, on environment. He's a little soft. That's not to take away from his efforts to shift the party to a more moderate center. He's trying to reinvent the Conservative Party, and I think that's healthy for Canadian politics to have that. But on some key issues, he's just not connecting. That's not to say he won't win seats in Quebec, but he's not going to have he might actually lose a few. Then the question is, does he lose them to the Bloc? Does Jagmeet Singh, NDP are down to 1 seat in Quebec right now. I don't see them breaking through. So it's either good news for Mr. Trudeau, where he'll pick up some more seats, because I think Mr. Trudeau is going to lose seats in Atlantic Canada. And not just because of the Nova Scotia election, which was quite an interesting local story of a Liberal government losing power to the Progressive Conservatives. But so if Mr. Trudeau comes out of the 4 Atlantic provinces dropping seats, he's certainly got to hope he's going to pick up some in Quebec. Ontario is going to be an interesting. Ontario's a bit like
I wanted
BC.
to get to Ontario.
Yeah.
Not to interrupt you, but we have been talking about O'Toole sort of around him. He has, I think, gone beyond people's expectations. I
Absolutely.
mean, he's definitely done much better than Mr. Scheer, I think, in terms of his public image.
Yeah.
He hasn't been brilliant, but he hasn't been terrible. You're right.
No.
He's been soft on some things like vaccines. I think he's been very soft on that issue, which I still think is a big mistake on the Tories' part. But on the other hand, Ontario, as you mentioned, that's the province where they were just recently throwing rocks at Mr. Trudeau.
True.
And it seems to me there's an awful lot of seats in Ontario that could turn Liberal to Tory. Now, some of them could turn NDP as well, but there's that Conservative group that supported the Ford movement provincially that could shift to the Tory movement federally. And that could be a big play in this, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I agree with you, Robin. You're right. There's, rich Southern Ontario in particular, the Greater Toronto area. I mean, it has more seats than BC, in total. Or, and you look at the Southern, Western Ontario, you start to add those seats up, and it's like the combined total of 3 or 4 other provinces. I mean, it's just massive. So there's what's called the 905 belt, which is the suburban belt that rings outside of the Greater Toronto area. So it's the more suburban. Some of them still are farming areas and more rural. I mean, I grew up in Toronto, so I kind of know that area. And you're right. There's some possibilities there where the Conservatives could pick up some seats. And so that'll be a question election night. And if they start to turn blue again, some of those seats, they'll say, well, that's credit to O'Toole. Whatever else you might want to knock him in his campaign, he's done something there that worked and clicked, and were able, whether they were disgruntled Liberals or Green votes or whatever, but he assembled a coalition of support again that revived. And then that makes it interesting for the Liberals, because they really are counting on, they're currently still in the lead in polls for Ontario, but that lead has shrunk. And so this last week, I think we'll see both O'Toole, we'll see all the leaders, but certainly O'Toole and Trudeau, they're both trading personal swipes today. In the news today, they're getting nastier. We're starting to see shades of the 2019 campaign. That was a pretty nasty, divisive campaign. The whole thing wasn't very pleasant, if you remember. And we've avoided most of that so far in this campaign. But this last week of the 2020 campaign could be a bad sequel to the 2019, and that we'll start to see a lot more personal attacking and are on ethics, integrity, vaccine, trustworthiness, COVID. The vaccine, the wedge issues coming back, gun control.
Robin and I have been around the block on this political stuff, and I'll tell you, the last week is just is hellish. Whether it's public or private, it gets nasty. And that's what we're about to see.
What I see also interesting, Robin, is Bill Blair, who is in the Trudeau cabinet. He represents a riding in Scarborough.
Former police chief.
Former chief police of Metro Toronto Police Force. I mean, they're starting to use him much more, I think, effectively, speaking out on the gun control issue. He's talking about the automatic weapons. So we're starting to finally see where Mr. Trudeau is stepping aside and letting some other of his team speak on issues where they've got the credibility, and certainly not the prime minister. And then that's not a knock against Trudeau, but it shows to me that their campaign headquarters people are starting to realize they've got some other people they should be and could have been using. And in this last week, yeah, so that battleground around Toronto and then that suburban belt outside, yeah, we could see some interesting switches there. Some of those seats that the Liberals did win last time, they were close. You know, they didn't win them big. In fact, of the top 10 closest ridings across the country, the Liberals won 9 of them. So they're vulnerable on a lot of seats flipping. And a couple of those are here in BC, but there's some in Ontario. If Mr. Trudeau is going to win a majority, and I doubt he will, he'd have to do really well in places like Hamilton, Ontario, Niagara Falls, Kitchener, Waterloo area, the Windsor, Ontario, that whole southwestern Ontario belt. And the polls aren't suggesting that. So, you know, we're looking at a minority government one way or the other.
So that's my wrap-up question, because we could go on. This is so rich.
Yeah.
This is great. I don't know why we waited so long to have you on the show, Michael.
Exactly.
Me either, guys. Me either. I mean, you knew my phone number.
I'd love to hear
give me
your
a call,
your
John.
prediction.
Come on.
Yeah, I know. Hey, I had to work through channels to get you for this show. I had to call your daughter. So that.
Oh, there you go. Well,
there you are. I was digging around to find you.
Not next time, though, Michael.
Next time, for sure. You'll be top of our thoughts. Sure. I want to wrap it with this, Michael. Then, are you going to give us a prediction? Do you feel that, despite the fact he called an election that people didn't really seem to want in the middle of the pandemic, has come across as Mr. Man with a $500,000 watch and a lot of other things that have been thrown at him, that Justin Trudeau is indeed going to hang on and still be the prime minister as of next Monday night?
Well, whatever the result, he'll be the prime minister Monday night, unless there's a shocking result like we saw, where there's just a collapse of the party where he finishes third, which is inconceivable at the moment. But, and he resigned that night and take it for the team, because a lot of his people didn't want this election either. So, but I at this moment, I see him losing about up to 20 seats. So dropping down to maybe into the 135, 140 zone, Robin. The question is, as you said, some of those really close ridings in Ontario, here in BC, how the Conservatives do, does Mr. O'Toole float up and does he get close to that 130 zone? Or, I mean, we could see it, as I say, we could see a scenario where it could be very close. It could be the shades of the 1972 election of Pierre Trudeau, who, Bob Stanfield, Pierre Trudeau, and at the end of the day, David Lewis, who was the leader of the NDP, kept Mr. Trudeau in power for a couple of years with kind of a minority agreement. It was less formal in those days, but, Justin doesn't want to see that. He doesn't want to see in 1972. He'd like to see it. I mean, he called this the most important election since 1945. That election, Mackenzie King won his third election. So that's what Mr. Trudeau would like to see. He'd like to become a Mackenzie King, although King did lose his majority.
if he wins a minority again, though, is his leadership threatened? Is he going to have to step aside?
Well, that'll be part
election. That'll
be part of the discussion, absolutely. And all eyes on Christy Freeland and some of the other prominent ministers in his cabinet. As I say, a lot of people in his caucus did not want this election. He called it before some people could qualify for the 6 years for the pension. So there's going to be a bit of grumbling there. So if the great leader who brought them from out of the backwoods in 2015 with that stunning victory, if he stumbles next Monday night, well, politics, Robin, as well as I do. The knives will be out. Everyone will say the right things for the first little while, but then there'll be these exploratory meetings. And off the record networking, right, about what the analysis will be. He inflicted this on himself, and would they have done better, both not only waiting, but could somebody else have done this and pulled it off for the Liberals?
Wow, what a great interview with Dr. Michael Prince. I agree with him. I think this election is going to be very close. I hope our vote makes a difference, and I can't wait to analyze this next week.
It's going to be big fun, John. And, this federal election, in some ways, it's already decided before it ever gets to us. But if it's as close as we're thinking, it could come down to what happens in British Columbia, even Vancouver Island. So that's kind of exciting. I don't mind that as somebody who's really a a political junkie. I have been for a long time. Back in the early 1990s, and 91 to be exact, when Mike Harcourt came in as the NDP Premier of British Columbia, coming in with his entourage was a communications and political strategist by the name of Brad Zubik, who I got to know back in the 90s and worked with fairly closely on certain issues when I was in the media and working on a show called Government Street. And Brad Zubik later on moved on. He joined another tent and worked with the federal Liberals and helped them in terms of getting elected in 2015, I guess it was, for their big return to power under Justin Trudeau. And now Brad has moved on to other things as well, but he remains a keen political observer and will be our guest on our next Rumble Room show. Can hardly wait to see Brad Zubik.
Right on. That name's very familiar to me. And there'll be a lot to analyze, won't there? Not only has this election been full of drama, the world is full of drama. And it's exhausting. So I'm glad we have a venue in which we can chat about these things and share our viewpoints and experiences with others. And there's so many ways in which you can share and listen to these expert commentators and expert analysts. And you'll see our links that are showing up exactly. Please make sure you support us if you like what we're doing. And I think amidst all of this crazy chaos, I think I remain the faithful Croatian sensation, John Jurison.
And I have my double vaccination. I have my vaccination passport. I've already gone out in the advanced polls and voted. I'm rocking Robin Adair.
God!
Zoom on.